Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 193 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. It can be hard looking back not to attribute to medieval people the prejudices of the centuries that have passed between then and now. This tendency is perhaps made most evident when it comes to discussing the presence of people of color in medieval Europe. Because those people who were invested in justifying the transatlantic slave trade in the early modern period were likewise invested in downplaying the majesty and sovereignty of African kingdoms, it can be easy for us to imagine that this tendency was also true of the Middle Ages. After all, we humans like to think in straight lines. Scholars in the last 20 years especially have shown that the kingdoms outside of Europe were both wealthy and respected, and this extended not just to the Mongol and Mamluk empires, but also to Ethiopia, Nubia, and Congo, to name just a few. As the Middle Ages passed, one figure began to consistently symbolize the wealth and, importantly, the wisdom of African kingdoms in European art: Balthazar. This week, I spoke with Dr. Bryan Keene about Balthazar. Bryan is a member of the art history faculty at Riverside Community College and a former curator in the Department of Manuscripts at the Getty Museum. He's the author of Toward a Global Middle Ages, Encountering the World Through Illuminated Manuscripts, and the co-author of several books, including The Fantasy of the Middle Ages, An Epic Journey Through Imaginary Medieval Worlds. Today we'll be talking about his most recent work, Balthazar, a Black African King in Medieval and Renaissance Art, which he's co-edited with Kristen Collins, and which contains sections by a wide range of scholars who we'll give a shout out to throughout the course of the episode. Our conversation on the origins of Balthazar, how he appears in medieval art, and how he continues to have an impact is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, Bryan, for joining me to talk about Balthazar. This is an absolutely gorgeous book and an important book, and I'm so happy that you're here. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to talk about the book. And since you mentioned that it's gorgeous, I just wanted to put a plug right at the beginning that the designers for this volume are Polymode Studios. And this is one of these incredible design firms. It's Black and Indigenous, queer, intersectional in every way. And the designers throughout really work to make this volume beautiful. And I hope we can talk about them a little bit later as well.
Yes, remind me, because I think that is absolutely awesome. And I did not know that, even though I've been looking at this book and admiring the pages so much. So yes, remind me, we'll get back to that later. Okay, so Balthazar, I'm not sure everyone knows him by name. Can you tell us who he is?
Balthazar is the traditional name given to one of the three individuals that brings gifts to the Christ child. There's a very long history about how many people would have brought gifts to the Christ child. We read a very short passage in the Christian New Testament about these individuals from the East called Magi who bring gifts to the Christ child upon his birth. And there are three gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and those gifts, their value, lends credence to the idea that they must have been brought by three individuals, possibly three wise men or three kings. And so gradually over the course of 1,000 years, their names become Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar. The names are never codified for one individual or another. The ages differ for the individuals. Their geographic locations differ. But by about 1500, Balthazar is the name given traditionally to the Black king among the Magi. But if you continue reading and looking at earlier images, you might find Caspar as the Black King or Melchior. So Balthazar is the name that we landed on as the name most traditionally used to refer to the Black King.
And when we're talking about Magi or Magi, not everyone went to Sunday school. Can you tell us what they are?
It's a great word. We get our word magician from Magi. The Magi were Persian stargazers, dream interpreters, philosophers. The word itself, magos, comes from Greek, and it's a term that's used throughout the New Testament. We read about Simon Peter Simon Peter the Magus as one of these individuals who perpetuated these ideas about magic or special feats and foresight. And so they are sort of elite individuals who watch the stars. And the story of the biblical Magi centers around a star that guides these individuals to Bethlehem to find the Christ child.
Yes, so they are absolutely educated. They are elite, whether or not they are kings. They are at the top of their fields, no matter what, right?
Indeed. And there's a long tradition in the history of Islam that also celebrates Magi. They appear in a number of Persian and Arabic texts. So these are individuals who would have been the highest level scientists of their day.
Right. And when they show up in the Bible, we have no description, as you're saying, of what they might have looked like, names, nothing, not even where they're from, right?
We have nothing. It just says in the Gospel of Matthew that Magi from the east, and anywhere east of Jerusalem then is essentially up for grabs. And over the course of the Middle Ages, that eastern location shifts. East is India, but east could also mean anywhere in Africa, using terms like Ethiopia to mean the entire continent. But then also gradually, East could include a king that looks like a European ruler. So it really was a malleable concept over the course of the Middle Ages.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember when we're thinking about east that even though people knew the directions by looking at the sun and shadows and all that stuff, not every map has north at the top in the Middle Ages, right? So that has an effect, I think, on what exactly is east.
Indeed, so many of the maps are either oriented with the south at the top of the page, which we find in the Islamic context, or they will have the extreme east at the top of the map as well. And it is interesting to think about when people leave their doors, what directions they think they're traveling in. And your point is a very good one. They knew about shadows and they understood the fact that the earth was round. That was never called into question. But where east was could be quite flexible.
Could be anywhere. It could be
It
anywhere.
really could, and it eventually it shifts to the Americas, as we'll uncover later.
Yes. And something that we've talked about on the podcast a bunch of times is that there is trade happening well beyond Europe. There's trade that's going on globally at this time. So people had an impression about kingdoms that were beyond Europe. So can you tell us a little bit about what you have in the book that tells us about trade, international trade?
Sure. This was, one of my favorite sections to write. This was the section that I helmed for the volume. We call it Connecting Continents Through Trade and Diplomacy. And the idea was precisely to your point, to remind readers who might be coming from a range of backgrounds, maybe not having had Sunday school classes or having not even dived deeply into world history, to understand that the Mediterranean that we see as a body of water between Europe and Africa was a vibrant crossroads of trade and travel. In addition, we might be familiar with something called the Silk Roads or the maritime Silk Roads of the Indian Ocean trade, but waters and land masses that we might think of today as barriers were thoroughfares for trade and travel. So we find
Mhm.
objects made in various locations in places far beyond their place of manufacture. These are stories that art historians and archaeologists and anthropologists and social historians have long told. And the subject of Balthazar is one that really lends to that lens because we often see Christian artists representing the three magi with turbans, which was a signifier of a kind of Eastern, possibly Muslim or even pre-Muslim origin, or elaborate textiles with beautiful brocade patterns, embroideries with Arabic or pseudo scripts that look like Arabic, Georgian, Hebrew, any number of languages that also would have indicated distance, but also the gifts that they brought with them in the works of art. Some resemble elephant tusks, ivory objects that would have been brought from West Africa or from East Africa or even from India. In later contexts, we see evidence of spice jars and spice objects. And that theme, I think, is one that was rich for study because the subject of Balthazar raises the question, who are the people and the objects themselves that would have inspired the representations of the kings and their gifts in medieval art? So it's not just a medieval and Renaissance story. We can go back almost to the beginning of time immemorial when people settled down and still extended their networks through trade and travel. We start to see that evidence even in the very early ancient period.
Yes, exactly. And when we have listed in the Bible, they brought gold, frankincense, and myrrh. I think that those are actually specified in the Bible, those three gifts. And if you're sitting in medieval Europe about to write something or paint something, you're thinking, where does gold come from? Where does frankincense come from? Where does myrrh come from? And what do those people look like, right?
It's very true. There was a wonderful exhibition that started in Chicago, went to Toronto, and then ended in DC called Caravans of Gold. And it really highlighted the fact that in the Middle Ages, the wealth of Europe was coming out of Africa. The
Mhm.
gold of Sigil Massa and of other West African cities and kingdoms was driving economies, not just in Africa and in Europe, but also across Asia. So that is one of the materials that would have had a number of associations, not just with Africa and West Africa in particular, but other wealthy kingdoms. Egypt, for example, was another great source of a golden kingdom going back to the Roman period. There are sources of gold even in Europe, as we know as well. Frankincense and myrrh then become more interesting from my perspective because they can be localized to the region around the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia, Eritrea. We also see evidence of myrrh in Saudi Arabia, also in parts of India. So already where these objects are coming from and how they're being used in ceremonial practices would have suggested a kind of Eastern or distant origin. And those terms distant, foreign, exotic were words that we wanted to call into question in the volume because
Hmm.
we had to keep asking foreign, exotic, distant, to whom? Because they
Yeah.
would not have been seen necessarily as a foreign object if you are the one who is gathering the myrrh from the trees and from the dried stuff in Ethiopia. But for a European audience, they were certainly luxurious objects brought from afar.
Yes. I think I should mention that we did have one of the curators from Caravans of Gold on the podcast really early on. So if people want to listen to that, they can listen to that. But I think that mentioning these African kingdoms is really important. I had Verena Krebs on a while ago talking about Ethiopia, and this is a very Christian kingdom, and they're traveling all over the place. But you're right, like in Ethiopia, the people who are further to the east would be a different perspective, right? These people might look different if you're sitting in Ethiopia than they would if you're sitting in the middle of France.
It's very true. And that was something that we wanted to highlight also in the volume is that, we give these names, Caspar, Balthazar, and Melchior, but something that I really wanted to look into, and I began looking into actually in 2008 with my colleague Jennifer Lee at the Getty, we had been teaching a course all about global connections in a primarily Western European art collection like the Getty. And at the time, we started to realize that while those are great names, Balthazar, Caspar, and Melchior, there are different names in different parts of the world. In Armenia, the names are very different. In Georgia, they're different. In Ethiopia, they had names that were different as well that also signaled something of these individuals' importance. Some of the names are homonyms with Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar, but
Mhm.
others are unique. They're very localized. And that's what I think is so beautiful about the story of the Magi, is that they could be really local and also present these global narratives. So even in Ethiopia, we'll often see the three kings in later history dressed in garments, textile patterns that we recognize as coming from India or China. So
Mhm.
even there, we have a context of a further Eastern kingdom of this story.
Yes, a mysterious kingdom, especially. Sometimes they're recognizable kingdoms, right? With the way that these people are dressed, as you say in illustrations. And sometimes they're kind of fantastic kingdoms. And I think this might be a good moment to bring up Prester John.
Prester John is one of these unusual figures. There are a number of stories about this mythical Christian priest king that originated somewhere in the east, in the land of India, in the land of Saba, which could be Saudi Arabia, and then later in the land of Ethiopia. And he's often presented as this promised Eastern Christian king or non-European, non-Mediterranean Christian king that will rescue Christian kingdoms from Muslim neighbors, Muslim enemies, Muslim insurgencies. So it becomes at the start a really Islamophobic text about this promised kingdom in the East, but it gradually also justifies missionary endeavors and colonizing efforts. We read really powerfully in the 1500s letters from the emperors of Ethiopia to the kings of Portugal saying that there is no king or Prester John in our lands, but there are emperors and rulers whose reigns date back to the early kingdoms of Christianity, with Ethiopia being one of the earliest Christian kingdoms. And so he's an important figure. We read about him. We see his name on maps. He appears all over the place. And most often in the maps that we talk about in the volume, he's centered somewhere around Ethiopia, but also can be fully in South Africa. So he's just one of these many mythical figures that we read about in the medieval sources. And I think he's one of the many contexts for viewing Balthazar in the images.
Yeah, exactly. And I think if you are a European and you encounter a king, because we know that kings did pilgrimages, you encounter a king who was just fabulously wealthy and all of those things, Christian as well, you might think, well, this is Prester John. This makes sense to me.
It's very true. And that the point about Christian kingdoms and other kingdoms in Africa was so important because, as you say, people in Europe and people in Far East Asia knew about the wealth and the power of Africa. And yet, so often when we had focus groups and talked with students and church groups and community groups and even colleagues on the ground at the Getty and beyond, so many individuals were maybe really familiar with Egypt as a powerful kingdom, but in antiquity. And then African history was sort of diluted in the minds of many of our colleagues until the moment of enslavement in the 1400s that extends all the way into, the legacy of enslavement lasts today, of course. But we wanted to really remind readers that there were many known powerful African kings, not just Mansa Musa, the wealthiest ruler who's ever lived, the wealthiest individual who travels on pilgrimage for his Muslim faith from West Africa all the way to Mecca, but also rulers like Zara Yacob in Ethiopia, who had extended trade relationships and diplomatic relationships with the Vatican, with the Pope, for example. And so that's one aspect of the book that we wanted to try to layer in, recognizing that it is complicated anytime you tell a history with many names and many kingdoms whose borders and shape of their realm are shifting throughout the period. But we did feel that it was important to continually remind people of their biographies, because biographies are something that we can relate to. And
Mhm.
biographies, also from a really nerdy academic point of view, are what we use to teach fourth graders about history and seventh graders about world history. And again, in high school, it's biographies that we center on. So that's why each of the texts in the volume center on the biographies of some Black African individual.
I think that's really important. And I think it speaks to the fact, well, speaks to the reason perhaps why these three individuals, became kings, became people who had a biography. So, you would have these three individuals that might have showed up in the Bible, and then you want to build a backstory for them. So, at what point does Balthazar become specifically a Black figure, specifically an African figure? Because this is something that is not continual from the moment that the Bible is written.
It's a great question. So, for nearly 1,000 years, the three magi are represented as white. Gradually, starting in the mid 1200s, we start to see evidence of signifiers of geographic origin. So we might see the presence of camels or monkeys or lions or even Black African individuals who are painted or sculpted with Black flesh tones or facial features and other characteristics that European artists would have understood, sometimes stereotypically, prejudicially, and really racist, to
Mhm.
indicate someone from Africa. And another point to make is that Africa in the Middle Ages, as today, was a place of people who are Black and white. There
Yes.
are Arab Africans, there are Christian Africans, Muslim Africans. There are many different ways to identify as African.
Mhm.
And how to present that story in an art historical volume is one that we wanted to try to pull apart. So 1,000 years of white kings gradually representing other members of their retinue as Black. And those images relate to broader imperial images that we see of the Holy Roman Emperor, for example, with Black Africans in his retinue. But when does Balthazar become a Black African king? That's really in the middle of the 1400s. It's after the 1440s with the Portuguese enslavement of Black Africans, the first time sanctioned by the church and by the crown. But in the middle of the 1400s, we also see convenings of the Christian churches in Europe, in Basel, in Ferrara, in Florence, in Rome. There were dignitaries coming to Europe throughout the long medieval and Renaissance period from Ethiopia, from Egypt, that would have represented the Christian kingdoms, the Coptic communities. But there were also instances of individuals that were serving as soldiers in the imperial guards, for example. So, another question to raise, and this was brought up by a number of our visitors, is visitors of color specifically, are there stories about Balthazar that can expand beyond the narrative of enslavement, which is important and yet better known, while also reminding individuals that, as we said earlier, there are powerful African kings that Europeans and others knew very well about, and other ways that Europeans could have encountered Black individuals? Dignitaries freed individuals in the city of Venice. We read about freed Black Africans that were serving as gondoliers. And that was a really exciting and important story to be able to tell. So it's a long process, but the middle of the 1400s, we start to see a Black African king among the Magi.
Yes, and it's established, it's continually established. When you first mentioned this book to me back in October, you said, it's Balthazar, it's this guy. And I think I had known his name from back in the early parts of my childhood. But in my nativity scene, from the 80s, there is the figure of Balthazar, who is recognizably a Black African king. So it's really established now, even though if you look technically at the Bible, it doesn't have a precedent there.
It's a great point. I'm so glad you mentioned nativity scenes, because one of the first social media initiatives I started before the exhibition opened, in fact, was to ask the audiences of the museum to look at nativity scenes, whether their own family scene or Christmas cards, holiday cards, nativity scenes in front of churches, to see if there was a Black king. And many individuals were sort of shocked, surprised, embarrassed that they hadn't noticed the Black king before, and then began asking, wait, why? And that was really interesting conversation to begin having on social media. And still others said, well, actually, my nativity scene, they're all white. And so we asked the question, well, what does that mean when we see this long history of either whiteness or of the inclusion of a black king? There was one story that we didn't get to tell in the volume just for sake of space and because it is really complicated and possibly quite painful. There are instances of sculptures and painted images of Balthazar and the three kings that were all white initially, but one of the kings was painted black later. We do tell the story very briefly in the case of one manuscript of the Getty. I write a little section about the three kings that in the 12th century were all white, but in the 15th century, one of their faces was painted black or brown, really. It's a sort of wash. And we know that that was an addition because the hands are still white, which is an interesting phenomena. But there are other later instances where the figures are painted in what some scholars have called a kind of blackface, where
Hmm.
you see figures that were carved or painted white who are now given black or brown skin, but with really racist stereotype features that we would see even today in some Magi processions that happen in parts of Europe where one of the individuals is wearing blackface. And that's a really painful history to acknowledge. But to be able to unpack it fully, we were only able to sort of hint at it in reference to the one manuscript, but then provide critical bibliography so that readers know that there is more work to be done. And that's true for all of the topics in the volume.
That is so true. There's always more work to be done and there's always more to be discovered. And you can't fit it all into one book. You've done a really admirable job with the authors that you've collected in this book. It's so well put together. And I think that the tone of it is just right, where you can have these really complex conversations, but the people who are writing for your volume are writing it in a way where you don't have to have had a background in these conversations. They will allow you to come into them and start to think about these topics without having had, a huge academic background on the complexities of these relationships.
Thank you for saying that. I do want to acknowledge each of the authors in a moment. And I also want to say that it was really instrumental to have students working with me along this process to read sample texts and to ask questions. Does this make sense? Is it accessible? Are there additional points of information that you would like to know that are maybe not as clear? And we asked the students to really speak to their families, ask their parents, ask their neighbors, ask their community members, go to their churches or classrooms and ask their peers if any of this is making sense. And in compiling the list of authors, there were so many people we wanted to work with, and I'm so thrilled with the ultimate lineup. Paul Kaplan had to be named number one on the list because his work from the early 80s, from his dissertation to his numerous studies into the present, have helped deepen all of our collective knowledge about images of blackness in the Middle Ages, and most specifically as related to the Magi. And Paul wrote 3 case studies for the volume, and one that was so enlightening for me to read and to continue to think about was the Christmas carol, We Three Kings of Orient Are. It's a
Yes.
carol that is familiar. It's one of the only early Christmas carols that's written in the United States by an American author, but then in one of the early illustrated editions, you have for the verse dedicated to Balthazar, a freed slave who holds the slaver's collar and is in the margins. And so there was already this kind of paired relationship. And Paul so beautifully tells this story of where we see Balthazar in public monuments, in private context, but also in the American context, because that was another context that we really knew we needed to acknowledge. Because in dialogues with our colleagues in Europe, there are different histories related to race. Certainly, the history of enslavement is a global history that is shared and that needs to be addressed, and spaces for healing created within those realms. But the way in which the history of enslavement and race specifically plays out in the United States today and in Canada, Mexico, and the rest of the Americas it's a different history. It's a different trajectory than that of Europe. Similar areas of accountability. So Paul addressed that. We also knew that we wanted a range of scholars, not just art historians or museum curators. And so bringing someone in like Geraldine Heng, who wrote the book on race in the Middle Ages, was an
Mhm.
obvious inclusion. And Jerry has been such a mentor, founding and being a founding member of the Medievalists of Color. She spent a lot of time sharing insights and helping me to come to terms with various aspects of mental health as an academic and parent. And so I'm so grateful, Jerry. I'll say it as many times as I can for all of your support. But Jerry had also written an earlier blog post for the Getty in relation to an earlier exhibit that helped inform the show, which was a show called Outcasts, all about prejudice and persecution. And the response by the public to her post was so powerful that we really wanted her to be in the volume. And she helped us to think I think, more deeply and critically about the ways in which race could be constructed. And her piece paired so well with the writing of Hussein Fancy. Hussein is another individual who works on aspects of race and religion in the Middle Ages. And it may seem for some reading it, wow, we have this really rich case study about the Cantigas de Santa Maria. We're really focusing on Spain. And it doesn't necessarily immediately jump out as related to the subject of Balthazar, but it is such an important story about Blackness specifically, and the way in which Muslims and also by proxy Jews were perceived in the Iberian Kingdom, which would be related to other realms in Europe. So their pieces really related well. And then if we continue on, Gus Casely Hayford, like Hussein, was invited to the Getty to participate in a series of public conversations. And Gus is such a dynamic speaker about the entire history of Africa. And what I love about Gus's piece is he reminds the readers, specifically to the point you raised, that there were innumerable kingdoms throughout the African continent since time immemorial. And he tells those stories in a very rich and powerful way. And he's followed by Andrea Acci from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And Andrea has long been a really great curatorial colleague, but also a friend. And she helped us think a little bit more about the material objects that were being traded. So beyond gold, frankincense, and myrrh, which we read in the Bible, what are the other commodities coming out of Africa that Europeans are really latching onto? So textiles became a really obvious material, but also silver works and gold works, and then the actual people themselves and their networks that arrive on the ground. I have to say, one of the pieces that brings me to tears every time I read it is Samantha Kelly's piece about the Ethiopian monks, because it begins from this place of here are these individuals who are no longer in their homelands of Ethiopia. They're thrust on the scene in Rome. And how do they survive? How do they get by on the street? How are they perceived? What are they seeing? And how can we now look at Ethiopian art from that perspective? And that was a kind of eye-opening moment for me to think about how do we then view Ethiopian art in, let's say, a context in the United States. So having worked at the Getty for nearly 14 years, what did it mean to then look at those objects in a museum in Los Angeles, knowing that we are surrounded by an exceptionally large Ethiopian population? And then just quickly, the other author that I was really excited to be able to work with was Cécile Froment. She's had a number of publications that have since come out, all about the Kingdom of the Congo, but also transatlantic, African and American kingdoms. Cecile writes about a really interesting figure who emerges on the scene slightly later than the Renaissance context, but many would have recognized him as Balthazar or would have assumed that he is Balthazar. And this is the bust of Antonio Manuel Nevunda, this individual from the Congo. And then framing the book in some ways are pieces that we knew from the beginning we needed to include. We needed to center Black voices from the start and include as many authors of color as possible and to really let them drive the way the book was structured. And so Henry Louis Gates, to receive a contribution by him was truly monumental. I don't even have the right words for it. He was able to look at every piece that was written in the volume and write a framing text that brought everything together in a really seamless way. And I'm so grateful that he, along the way, very gently and respectfully helped fact check some of the work that I wrote for the volume and also push a little bit to not tiptoe around topics that are quite painful. And then we also have a wonderful series of contributions and an ending piece by Tyree Boyd Pates, who I'll encourage all listeners to go to his website, Tyree Boyd Pates, and follow up on all of his writings and his work. He is one of the great leaders of our world today, and he writes about what does it mean to talk about Balthazar and exhibitions about Blackness in an American context when centering Black audiences. So that's a real quick overview. I can't say enough how grateful I am for all of the authors for their patience with this really challenging project, challenging on a number of levels, to write these texts in the midst of continued police brutality towards Black individuals in particular, communities of color more directly. So I know that was a lot, but I feel that it's so important to have had all of those voices and to have been able to have a series of conversations for about 8 months prior to the actual writing of the volume. And with some individuals, these are conversations we actually ended up having for 5, 6, 7 years before the book actually became a concept. So it's been a great project to work on from the collaborative perspective.
Yes, absolutely. And we have to give a shout out as well to your co-editor, Kristen Collins. And then we should also mention that, Bryan, you polled a bunch of the authors, but everyone is very busy. This is a busy, busy academic time. So we didn't cut out anyone from this podcast, but everyone is particularly busy at this moment in the semester. And I really want to acknowledge how wonderful these essays are. And I'm glad that you went through them individually. And I really like how personally the authors in this collection engage with the work. There are moments where they say, I was moved by this. And I think it's good to have these visceral reactions to art. I mean, this book is a book about art, and it's good to include those, even if you're coming at it from, I'm an academic and I'm going to tell you the background of this. I think it's so important to say, I was moved by this, or this is important to me. And I think that's one of the strengths of the book.
Thank you. It was really at the recommendation of the internal editor, Elizabeth Nicholson, to have those moments of personal reflection because it would model, hopefully, for the readers that they too can have those reflections. Just as you say, academics, we are drawn to this work largely for personal reasons, even when it's a really specific niche topic. I think there are personal driving factors, and especially a topic that deals with identity. I think you're absolutely right.
Well, this might be a good moment to ask you, were there any images that you collected for this book that particularly spoke to you or you found moving or that you found troubling? Are there any that stick out in this beautiful collection of art?
Golly, there are so many. I have to say, having worked at the Getty for so long, Andrea Mantegna's Adoration of the Magi is one that always stood out to me, even from my early days as an educator. And it's one that, again, my colleague Jennifer Lee and I talked about in 2008 in this really intense gallery course. And what we realized then is that the biography that's often told about that painting centers around Andrea Mantegna as a court artist. He was the court artist in Mantua for the Gonzaga family and worked for Isabella d'Este as well, who was the Marchioness in Mantua. And yet, the other biography that's often told in that painting is of the Chinese porcelain. The eldest Magi in this painting holds what is often considered one of the earliest accurately represented pieces of Chinese porcelain in European art. And we know that droves of Chinese porcelain are arriving on the market and imitation ware from Iznik, Turkey, works that were being produced in Italy and Spain, for example. But I was troubled, and I'm still troubled, that so much of the biography of that painting is about the Chinese cup, overlooking the fact that there is a black king in the painting, and that we don't know the exact date that Mantegna painted this work, but it fell somewhere between 1495 and 1505 based on other circumstances in his life, when he was in Northern Europe earlier or in Rome and would have encountered freed African communities in the Veneto and dignitaries in Rome. But at that moment, when he is working as a court artist, we know that Isabella d'Este is acquiring enslaved children. And she was having a kind of competition with her mother to enslave the darkest children possible. And when you read those documents and when you see the names that were given to these individuals, often in the same folios or same volumes of textiles from Damascus or, Greater Syria, porcelain from wherever, and the names of children, I just felt like we had an opportunity to tell a story about the people that Mantegna came into contact with. And Stephen Campbell has written a great new volume about Mantegna, and there's a lot more context there about the poems that were written, poems that addressed Blackness and Black youth at the time. And so that was a story that I knew we wanted to tell, and Kristen and I talked quite a bit about. In the exhibition that preceded the publication, though, we were encouraged not to, and in fact, one of the exact quotes from a colleague was, not to allow the painting by Andrea Mantegna to become the poster child for the history of slavery. And I remember sitting with that statement for a while and thinking, it already is. And whether we acknowledge it or ignore it, someone is going to realize that point and will ask the question about our authenticity and integrity as curators. There have been so many publications by Kate Lowe and Paul Kaplan and a number of others who draw our attention to the named individuals. Maestro Petro, a 9-year-old boy at the court, called the Ethiopian. Those are the names of individuals that I wanted to really center. And that was something we kept trying to return to, this idea. Can we talk about the painting by Mantegna without centering Mantegna or without centering Isabella in the very positive way that she's often rightly celebrated as this woman patron in a world of male dominance? That's an important narrative. We can still raise the question about race. And so in the gallery, that story of Isabella's enslavement was on an adjacent wall so that visitors could really look at this picture and try to come to terms with the porcelain and the black figure and the turbans and the Arabic script because it's complicated. So that's one that I still sit with, trying to think these works are the poster children in a way for the history of enslavement. And that's one history, in addition to the freed communities and the African kings that we talk about. One of the sections, though, that was on the chopping block all throughout for either word count numbers or that it was seen as somewhat too distant and too out there was about the Americas, because the history of enslavement, in my mind, couldn't just be introduced as a European and an African story. The history of enslavement is an American story. The earliest Black Africans that emerge, we start to see all across the Americas. And so that was a story that I wanted to think critically about. How do we tell the story of the images of the kings when these works are now being produced by individuals who had traveled to the Americas? So a work by a Portuguese artist, Vasco Fernandes, that shows Balthazar as a Tupi Namba chieftain from Brazil with a feathered headdress and holding a Tupi spear. That to me showed the flexibility of Balthazar as a subject, as a figure. There were other images that we didn't visualize in the volume, but that I reference in terms of print culture in Europe that Paul Kaplan has long referenced, spread images of Balthazar around the world. And what I keep finding are ivory carvings that are based on European prints from Sierra Leone to Ethiopia to India to the Philippines and to Mexico, where you see a black figure among the kings. And so that's a story that we hint at, but I hope the visitors, or readers rather, will really look critically into that longer history, because that's the goal of any exhibition or book, is to provide enough a background to the material with many voices as possible, and then to encourage you to go out there. So I would say it's definitely the Mantegna and the Portuguese image of the three kings. They continue to stand out.
Yeah, well, there were some things that stood out when I was reading it. I remember Henry Louis Gates said that every image of Balthazar has a symbolic weight. He's not just one figure, he's all figures. And then Jerry Hang was talking about having Balthazar represented as a king shows the universalness of Christendom, right? And I think that's something that you're getting at in the later works when you have a Brazilian king. This is showing like how universal Christianity is. And I think that was probably the intent of the artist, saying this Christianity is available to everyone across the world, whether they want it or not, I suppose.
It's very true. And, that was something that Mary Miller, the director of the Getty Research Institute, included early on, was that the Americas couldn't just be an appendix, that they needed to be included. And I think she was encouraging us to think even more broadly and more globally, thinking about why are there Black angels that appear in American nativities from Mexico to South America, and the number of Black saints that appear in the Americas. There's an exhibit on Juan de Pareja, an Afro-European painter that has just opened at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. There's a book by Aaron Rowe that is all about Black saints in this transatlantic context and their earlier medieval precedents. So there's so much, and I'm glad you called out Skip Gates' point about Balthazar is all of these people.
Yeah, absolutely. And while we're talking about the Americas, let's talk about this designer that you were mentioning. I don't want to forget talking about the designers who put the book together. You were saying that it's important to put them front and center. So let's take a moment to put them front and center.
Well, Polymode Studios has designed so many of the most beautiful and thoughtful volumes for the most important museums across our country for a number of years now. And the lead team for this project was Brian Johnson, Michelle Lamb, and Silas Monroe. And what I love about their process is one of the first things that they wanted from us as a team was a playlist. What music inspires you? And not just the historical, liturgical chant or hymnology that we might associate with the medieval period, but other works. So I was thinking early on about Beyonce's Lemonade album, and that there are so many great songs on this album that speak to power and kingship, or Janelle Monáe. So we really thought with them, and there's a great playlist that then they developed as a kind of inspiration for working on the text. It's always difficult when you're not affiliated with an institution to then work for an institution. So even though I had worked for the Getty for 14 years, I was working on this project as a community college instructor. And so there were aspects of the project that seemed quite unfamiliar to me, even having had a long history of working with the Getty. And I think it was wonderful to work with a team that had a creative vision from the beginning, and they were really willing to push the boundaries as much as possible within a framework, because of course a volume would need to look like it is a Getty book. And yet I think on a number of levels, it's the saturation of colors that they brought, the way in which they thought critically about typeface and page layout, breaking outside of the traditional boundaries so that images span the upper corners and lower regions, and that we have these beautiful color boxes to indicate text fields. But their number one contribution in my mind was after I worked with a number of students in our disability services group that said, some of these typeface color field contrasts are really difficult to read for people on the spectrum, for individuals who might have reading challenges, whether dyslexia or others. And they really took that to heart and altered in almost third pages, I want to say, or final pages, the typefaces to accommodate those concerns. And that flexibility is one that I can never thank them enough for. And the way that they really valued the opinions of students while also going up against a major bureaucratic institution that also, needed to keep costs in order and realize that if you change something so late, it has ripple effects. But they have been instrumental, and I'm glad to think about what next project we can do together, because I just am so inspired by the work that they've done.
Yeah. And I think it just goes to show that the best work is intersectional work that takes into account everybody's background and needs. And I think that's super important. Okay, before we say goodbye, when people are looking to the Middle Ages, we'll come back to the Middle Ages here, and they're looking at images of Balthazar, or you're looking for images of Balthazar, what would you like them to keep in mind as they are looking through these images of the Nativity?
A few points. The first thing is to notice, how is Balthazar represented in comparison to the other kings? Throughout the volume, we make a point about the complexion of Balthazar. And when you start to look closely, you'll see that some of the images of Balthazar are painted with very dark black colorants, others that are brown washes. There are still other instances where he has a bluish purple complexion. And that's something that you should just notice, that we sometimes use black as a signifier for Balthazar in general, but there are numerous instances where Balthazar is brown, gray, blue, purple. So that's something to notice. But something that a colleague of mine, Aliyah McDaniel, who was a curatorial associate at the Getty, reminded me is that once you notice that he's black or that he has a dark complexion by comparison, what else is there? Is there a headdress? Is there a vessel that he holds? Is there an aspect of his costume or textile, or the animal that he rides? All of those tell us something about what the European artists are trying to get at. And I would be totally remiss if I didn't mention that we also included little call outs to contemporary artists of color who have been thinking about these themes of kingship. Rashad Newsom, Carlos Motta, Peter Brathwaite, and Kara Walker are included in the volume, in addition to references to the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the film Black Panther. Those were so important to highlight in the volume so that visitors can also see that there are relevant connections to be made today in the contemporary art world all around us.
Well, thank you so much, Bryan. I think that is a great way to wrap up this thinking about the book. And again, a shout out to all of those authors who are busy, and we wish them the best as they wrap up this semester. But thank you so much, Bryan, for coming on talking about this book. It's gorgeous, and I think everyone should read it.
Thank you for having me.
To find out more about Bryan's work, you can follow him on Twitter at Bryan Keene or at Medieval Art. His new book, co-edited with Kristen Collins, is Balthazar, a Black African King in Medieval and Renaissance Art. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's up this week, Peter?
Hey, well, we just had our first online conference. It's something that we co-hosted with the journal After Constantine and the Orthodox Academy of Crete. It was a conference on Easter in late antiquity, in the Middle Ages. Collection of 9 papers. I had a great time. I didn't have to do too much. I just presided over a session, but it was great listening to these papers, talking all about the religious aspects, social aspects of Easter, all the way from Northern Europe into the Byzantine world.
The type of conference where you need to bring your chocolate eggs, right?
Oh, yeah, exactly. Oh, and you can do it from home. So, it was great. I've enjoyed, more and more doing online conferences. When it kind of started a few years ago because of the pandemic, like, oh no, I'm missing out. But these things can be really insightful, and you can relax. And I know coming up to Kalamazoo time, I'm heading there, but you're going to be watching from home for the International Congress on Medieval Studies.
Yes, it would be hard to find a dog sitter at this point in his life.
So yeah, conference season is gearing up and I'm really excited about it. I've been busy with starting to prepare my own conference paper. And, meanwhile, we'll try and get stuff on the website too.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Peter, what are you presenting on at Kalamazoo this year?
I always do these medieval military sessions, and this time I'm doing the Battle of Yarmouk, which is the 7th century battle between Arabs and Byzantines. Very famous, but not covered very much at all. So I am being a little sly about it and kind of comparing it to Star Wars.
That is what is brilliant about Kalamazoo. You can get papers on Star Wars.
Yes, I caused trouble. But yeah, so I'm kind of looking at it like Rebels versus Imperials and storytelling and things like that.
Very nice. And I bet the research is extra fun for that.
My presentation, my PowerPoint is going to be really good.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, Peter, for stopping by.
Thanks.
This week on my new podcast, Extra Medieval, I'll be talking more about the great work to be found in this book on Balthazar, as well as some other resources on the global Middle Ages. Extra Medieval is a show I've created just for subscribers where I get to expand on the topics covered on the Medieval podcast, as well as to tell you about new articles, historical tidbits, and even modern research. Join me for Extra Medieval on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Patreon. While I'm on the topic of Patreon, thank you to everyone who supports this podcast, as well as other indie podcasters and historians through medievalist.net's Patreon page. Patrons can access all sorts of awesome stuff like subscriptions to the Medieval Magazine and Medieval World Magazine, as well as ad-free versions of this podcast and Extra Medieval. To get in on all the action, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from Kings to Rings, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or Twitter @medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulski, on social media at 5MIN-medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of How to Live Like a Monk, Medieval Wisdom for Modern Life, in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself a fantastic day.